Landlords in Boston, Massachusetts let it be known that they were highly opposed to rent control measures within the city limits for tenants. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over rent control. Now, up in Massachusetts, rent control is actually against the law. So about 30 years ago, they passed a law that said that there could be no rent control within the state. But now, guess what? The mayor of Boston actually ran on a platform where she decided she wanted to push for rent control within the city limits to, tackle the high housing costs. But she has to get through that state law first. So, she is looking for public input to try to see if people are opposed to it or not. And fortunately, a lot of Boston landlords, they showed up at one of these sessions where they could discuss the reasons why they think rent control is a bad deal. And I completely agree with everything these landlords were saying. They even came up with a few points that I haven't thought of myself. So it's really interesting article. And, of course, they talk to the tenants as well, but I'm going to not read much of the tenants' parts because it's the same old garbage about how they don't think that it's fair that a landlord can raise the rents. I mean, come on here. So, it boggles my mind that there's a lot of people and they don't understand that, hey, you know what? Boston is a very big city in a very popular area, and a lot of people want to live there. That is why the housing costs are high. Okay. On top of that, there's not a lot of new development. Not at least not the amount of development that a city that size needs. And so when you have a huge demand for an area and not enough supply, guess what? Prices are going to go up. Okay. And you see this in a lot of very popular areas, so it shouldn't be surprising that, hey, this place is going to be a lot less affordable than other places. But, we keep coming back to the same conclusion, and they think that, hey, if we cap the amount of rent that landlords can charge, then that will solve the housing crisis. No, it won't. It will not. It never has worked. Regardless of what these people think, it does not work. And it will discourage new development. It will discourage people from wanting to rent their properties. And it creates a situation where the fortunate few who have these rent-controlled units, they're the only ones who benefit. Anyone else who doesn't have a rent-controlled unit, or who is moving into the area, or if you're a property owner who has to rent your place out under these rent-control conditions, well, you suffer. Okay, and you're not going to appreciate this law at all. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit that like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below. And I'm just curious, out of curiosity, if you're a landlord, have you ever been to a city council meeting or a public hearing with regards to new legislation for landlords or anti-landlord legislation up wherever you live? Okay, I personally have not, but that is one thing that I plan on doing. They're always coming up with these new rules, regulations, and laws, every jurisdiction throughout the country, that affect landlords, right? And we need to show up at these city council meetings and let our voices be heard. And I haven't been doing that myself, so that's one of those things that I'm going to have to do as well. Anyway, this article is coming from the Bay State Banner, and it says, Bostonians air views on rent control. Mayor's office holds first listening session. Yeah, I mean, at least for now, the state of Massachusetts has banned rent control, and that's a good thing, right? But with the way public opinion is shifting and, there's a lot of push towards this socialism nonsense, it wouldn't surprise me if in the future they get that repealed. So let's get into the article and see what it says. Last Tuesday, the Mayor's Office of Housing held its first listening session to discuss Mayor Wu's rent stabilization initiative, a policy that she plans to put before state lawmakers next year. In March, Wu established a 23-member advisory committee tasked with studying local housing conditions and the feasibility of rent stabilization measures. As part of that effort, the group has asked for public feedback on the state of housing affordability and the potential solutions to make the city more accessible. The mayor ran her campaign largely on the promise of helping combat rising rental costs and displacement, including rent control, which was outlawed by Massachusetts voters nearly 30 years ago. So yeah, when they elected this politician, they knew that, hey, she is pushing for rent control. That is her whole platform right there. Now, obviously, Massachusetts is the largest city within the state, or Boston is the largest city within the state of Massachusetts, right? So do I think that they might be able to get this law, this state law that prevents rent control repealed? Yeah, I do. Okay. And it wouldn't surprise me if that is the very next thing that happens. If next year, when this proposal comes up, they repeal the rent control law, and then Boston, if not the entire state, throws rent control over all the landlords there. That's why it has to be fought right now. Okay. In its first rent stabilization listening session with the public, nearly 300 people joined in over Zoom, sharing their thoughts, mostly on whether they are for or against any form of rent control or rent stabilization, terms that have been used interchangeably since the mayor first campaigned on the issue. A mix of landlords and affordable housing advocates gave testimony that ultimately turned adversarial in its tone. Landlords painting rent control as a disastrous policy, while tenants struggling to find affordable housing painted it as a vital lifeline. Yeah, but here's the thing. The tenants don't know if it's destructive or not, because whether there's rent control, basically whether the landlord is in financial ruin or not, they get cheap rent. So to them, it's not disastrous. Like, oh yeah, you put something in place where, gas is always $1 a gallon. Well, as a driver, I'm always going to benefit. But guess what? It would destroy all the oil providers, all the gas stations, all the processors. They would be destroyed because they would be unable to make money. Okay? They would have to just close down and shut shop because they would just be hemorrhaging money. That's why price controls don't work. These people don't realize, hey, you put this price control over the rental properties, and what's going to happen? Okay, they're going to be the ones who are unable to make money. Well, their properties are going to fall into disrepair. Maybe that's what they want, though. They want the properties to fall into disrepair, the property owners unable to pay their taxes, and then they want the government to step in and take those properties so they can become public housing. But somebody still has to pay. And that's what the hard fact that a lot of people don't understand. When a building is public housing, when the government takes over, someone still has to pay. Okay? The government, even itself, isn't exempt from the cost of things. Okay? The only way the government can raise money, though, is through taxes. So when you go into the government owning all of the property, well, if you want to pay just a crap ton of taxes, and get provided subpar housing, well, guess what? That's a great idea. Otherwise, the best thing possible is to have a private market where the private landlords are able to raise their rents and lower their rents with the market, for charging what the people are willing to pay based on supply and demand, and then they get quality housing. But they think that the open market is a bad thing, and they think that the government somehow is better. And we see how ruinous the government can be in everything they touch. So I'm going to skip down a little bit. They actually talked to some renters, and I'm not interested in their story, but let's get straight into what the landlords are saying. Among those who testified vehemently against rent control were a representative from the organization Mass Landlords, reps from the leasing company 617 Living, and the online rental database Boston Pads, and a spattering of homeowners calling themselves small landlords. Referring to her current model as a mom-and-pop operation, Alexandra Barch, whose family has owned 30 units in Alston since the 1960s, said rising inflation has already taken a dent out of landlords' earnings, and that rent control prevents price adjustments based on market conditions. There is no stabilization for our mortgage. There's no stabilization for taxes, which keep going up. There is inflation, she said. There's no stabilization for the plumbers or the contractors who have to repair these places. And she is absolutely correct. Like I said, they are only capping how much the landlords can charge. That doesn't mean that, hey, well, you know what? The new air conditioner that I have to put in the building, it's going to be the same price it was 5 years ago. No, the price of that new air conditioner increased with inflation. The price for the air conditioner installer increased as well with inflation. The price of fuel, the price of everything has gone up. Yet you expect landlords not to raise the rent? You're out of your minds, okay? Now, I got an interesting video coming up in the future where we actually go over how much profit landlords actually make from a property and how much their expenses actually take away from the rental income that tenants are bringing in. Because I think a lot of tenants are of the impression that, hey, you know, that rent payment, the landlord keeps all of it and it's all profit. Well, that is so far from the truth that it's not even funny, okay? And I'll be making a video explaining and doing a breakdown of all of the expenses and everything that a landlord has to take from that rent payment before they're able to make a very, very small profit, okay? But anyway, back to this article. Barch went on to say that her family was nearly forced into bankruptcy by rent control decades ago. Rent control always fails and decimates the housing stock and does not work in favor of the people who need it most, Barch said. Other issues raised on the anti-rent control side of the issue included hesitation to raise prices on loyal elderly tenants. Multiple landlords presented the scenario in which rent control would go into effect and prices would permanently remain in a lowered state. Yeah, this is something that I brought up a long time ago, and pretty much every time that I cover this rent control issue. Simply put, right, there's a lot of landlords out there, and they do not raise the rent on their tenants. Their tenants are so far below the market rent that, you know, it's not even funny. And those landlords are perfectly fine with it for whatever reason, you know, be it that they own the property outright and they just want a little minuscule profit and they don't care if the tenant's paying below market, or maybe the tenant has been good to them and this is kind of like a reward. But imagine, you know, just as an example, okay, the local market rents are $1,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment, but you have a tenant in your unit who's only paying $400 a month. Well, then suddenly the city comes in and puts rent control over your building. So you have a tenant in here who's at $400 a month, and that tenant finally, you know, they move on to another building or whatever, right? Well, you can't charge any higher than 3% higher rent on that unit. So what's 3% of $400? Like $12 more a month. Okay, so the next tenant moves in, and you can only charge them $412 a month. And meanwhile, the brand new apartments down the street are renting for $1,000 a month for the exact same units. So what is the motivation for that landlord to do any upgrades or bring it up to the new current condition? There's zero motivation. Okay. And this is why a lot of these buildings that are under rent control end up, you know, just dilapidated, falling apart, just barely patched together so that they are livable. Okay. Because there's no motivation for the landlords to do anything more than the bare minimum. So let me skip down a little bit more. Stuart Schreier, a landlord himself but also an attorney for landlords across the state lobbying against rent control, said Tuesday that the policy is going to force him to raise rent. I could triple his rent and still be below market, Schreier said of his longtime upstairs tenant, but I don't want to do that. Additionally, a common thread throughout the anti-rent control side's testimony was the idea that regulating a free market, one with such a limited commodity, was out of the city's purview. The fact is, it's a supply and demand issue, said Chris Bratsis. The idea that the government wants to govern and take away my private ownership and what I do with my property and who I rent it to is, to me, an absurd notion. Hey, and it's absurd to me as well, okay? So, you know, I'm sure every landlord who's watching this right now can't believe just how ridiculous that is, because, you know, the government does not own your property. The government doesn't do the upkeep on your property, but they want to regulate how much you can charge. They don't know your books. They don't know what your finances are or what the financial situation is. They don't know how much your mortgage payment is. They don't know how much you're paying for insurance. They don't know how much the utilities cost. They don't know how much your maintenance is. Yet they're telling you that, hey, we know more than you do about how much you should charge for rent. They don't know anything about your finances, and they're telling you that. That's absurd, okay? And I can't believe that it's true. But, all I can say for now is landlords up in Boston, keep fighting against this, okay? Make your voices heard. And what another thing is, I say stress to the other property owners, people who own their own houses, even if they don't rent them out, that this can affect them too, okay? Simply put, even if you just are trying to do a short-term rental, or you could fall under these same rent control rules. Even if you are just renting out one bedroom in your house, or if you have just one property that you rent out for a few months a year, you could fall under these same rent control rules and end up in a nightmare situation. Okay, and taking away anyone's property rights is a bad idea. Slippery slope. That's what I've always said. It's a slippery slope.